30,000-foot overview, and then we're going to begin this discussion.
Well, very short version of the story is I was born in the Soviet Union in the early 80s, and I grew up in that society. I then saw that society collapse around me as I was a young kid, and my family involved in various aspects of that. My father was, he was kind of like a mini oligarch turned government minister under Boris Yeltsin, turned, what would be the right way? He had to flee the country under a false identity because he was falsely accused of a bunch of things, since vindicated. And my parents, when that brief period in their time, when they had a bit of money, they sent me to England to boarding school, which is how I ended up here in the UK.
For the sake of argument, it's an interesting tactic, confounding taking strategic points of interest in the conflict in the context of a conflict versus taking the entire country. So why would they take an airport? I presume it's so that they can secure
the capital, Kiev. It's in the center.
No, but I understand. But I think we disagree on that as a matter of fact. I don't think at any.
What do you mean we disagree on it as a matter of fact?
That my understanding is not that at any point that Russia was trying to take Kiev.
Well, then you need to do more research.
Okay, but and if I'm wrong, that's where the internet will say Viva was wrong as a matter of fact. Konstantin was right as a matter of fact.
I understand the argument about NATO expansion provoking Russia, but what people never seem to think about is, okay, let's say NATO didn't expand after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland wouldn't be part of NATO. Do you think that they would still be independent countries? This is what Russia does every time that it's able to centralize and coordinate power. My view is that it is in our interest, particularly in the interest of the United States and the UK, to prevent Russia from doing that. The Ukrainians want to defend their country, and it's an incredibly effective way for us to do that by providing them with the support that they need. That's my opinion. I've never advocated for any country in which I'm not a taxpayer to do that, but as a taxpayer in the UK, I support my country doing that.
When you go back to the Maidan revolution in 2014 and how that plays into this, where do you not get the sense, notwithstanding what you might feel are, I don't know, they call them imperialistic tendencies of Putin, can barely manage his own country, might not have global domination on the checklist. But the revolution starting in 2014, do you not see potentially Western interference, Western meddling?
Every revolution has foreign meddling. If you think about the American Revolution, did the French not help quite a lot? Were they not involved in that? Every revolution, whenever there is a revolution, foreign actors will attempt to interfere. But what actually happened in 2014 was President Yanukovych promised the people of Ukraine after being elected that he would sign a trade deal with the European Union. And under pressure from Putin, he changed his mind and promised to sign one with Russia instead. A bunch of students went out and protested about this. There weren't very many of them. They weren't particularly disruptive. And Yanukovych sent in riot police, who beat them up. And that's the point at which ordinary people went out into the street to protest about the treatment of these students. They cracked down on the new protesters again, tried to beat them up, brutalizing the protesters. And that's why the Ukrainians came out into the streets in the tens of thousands in Maidan. Was America unhappy that Ukraine was moving in a pro-Western direction? Of course not. But this was a country that was a puppet of the Russians, and they reacted to the fact that it was no longer going to be that in 2014 by biting chunks of Ukraine. This is the problem that Ukraine's always faced. It's not really a country that's existed for a very long time because it lies on the border between two great civilizations, and it's always been disputed territory. It's a great tragedy of the lives of the people who live there.
I see similarities in the way Western governments have carried out their atrocities. They do it in a manner that allows them nonetheless to judge and create international conflict on the basis of other dictators doing it not so politely. So Putin.
That's why I was so vehemently opposed to the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the intervention in Syria, the intervention in Libya. I disagree with the West foreign policy on all of those countries, but this isn't the same. This is a country that's been invaded, that is asking for help defending itself. This isn't Iraq, where we just came in and decided to remove the person who runs that country. You mentioned earlier financing conflict. I mean, that's a way of phrasing it that I disagree with, because you're not financing conflict. You're allowing people to defend themselves who are being slaughtered.
What is going to be the solution? Because people are going to look at you, Konstantin, and say, what you're suggesting is victory at all costs.
No, when did I suggest that?
Well, because you're saying if you're dealing with a Hitler, If people view,
when did I call him Hitler?
well, no, well, okay. If you're dealing with someone who you think has,
this is what people who think what you think about people who think what I think.
Well,
but
no,
I
because-
don't say any of those things. I didn't say Putin was Hitler. I didn't. You said he was a murderous dictator. Now he is, but I don't use that as a reason. I said it is in the West's interests to prevent an irredentist Russia from expanding westward.
one does not have to say Hitler in order to conceptualize a Hitler-esque someone bent on territorial conquest. But let's, okay, you're right.
I don't think that was actually people's problem with Hitler. I think it was more to do with the Holocaust and everything. But look, I am not like, oh, Putin is bad, we must, like, that's not what I'm saying. Putin is doing what any Russian leader who's achieved the consolidation of power that he has achieved would do in his position. As a professional former translator, I translated his speeches and I put them on my Substack so you can hear from the horse's mouth what he wants. And both him and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, have been extremely clear what this is all about. They want what they call a new world order. And that means pushing America off its pedestal and creating this multipolar world, right? What do they mean by that? They mean a world in which China and Russia and the United States are equals. And what you're going to get is actual World War III.
See, that's where the issue. If one is comfortable with an American-dominated world, you're comfortable with a world in which the atrocities, the war crimes are just committed.
No, I'm not.
Well, because
I am against those things. Those invading Iraq and invading Afghanistan was not necessary for the United States to remain a superpower in the world. Those are foreign policy mistakes that I disagree with. The same with Syria, the same with Libya. You don't have to buy into the neocon project to think that America is a force for good in the world, which it is.
Well, getting into that, America being a force for good in the world, and the Russian New World Order, it does seem, or it does feel like America itself is working towards a New World Order itself as well by forming basically a global type government, which is why I think people are actually sort of amenable to looking at Putin and Russia, not China so much, but Putin and Russia as sort of the resistors to what people see as the New World Order of the West, which is dominated by all of the things that you noticed in Russia back in the day: censorship of free speech, censorship of free thought, getting people to believe the absurd that men can be women, women can be men, and that the people in Chernobyl were not radioactive. It was just in their heads.
Right.
So
you don't think this happens in Russia now?
Well, I could say this. I don't know what happens in Russia now.
Okay, so in Russia now, if you call the war in Ukraine a war, you go to prison for 10 years.
Okay,
that's what happens in Russia.
Now,
is that the multipolar world that you want to be living in?
Well, but then the flip side to that is in the Ukraine, if you act in a country, I don't even know if you're allowed to even say things anymore in the Ukraine.
There you are.
It's just as tyrannical as in Russia, but for the good.
No. In Ukraine, what's happening? This is a country at war that's defending itself, and it operates under wartime rules, right? All this stuff about how he's banned the Orthodox Church, complete bullshit. What he banned is the Russian Orthodox Church.
One element, yeah, that got sort of blown up.
Who were open collaborators with Russia. And I know this because I have members of my family who are part of that church who were saying to me on the day the invasion happened, I am so glad they've invaded. Right. So I know about these people. People say Zelensky's banned political opponents. Oh, no, he banned Viktor Medvedchuk, whose daughter's godfather is one Vladimir Putin, who's been funded for 20 years from Russia to create an alternative power structure in Ukraine. Right. And the reason Zelensky's banning these people is they're open collaborators with the enemy. What did the United States do when they were attacked at Pearl Harbor? Took 120,000 Japanese Americans and threw them in internment camps.
Yeah,
right?
they committed.
Zelensky hasn't done that.
Well, I'll tell you this, okay, and this actually, it comes back to something in the beginning where you say, look, if you're going to have a conspiracy to really prevent a Hitler from rising to power, it really had better be Hitler. And now it's like, it sort of seems like it's been watered down, where you can ban political opponents if they're related to someone who's a political adversary.
No, not related, funded by, in order to create an alternative power structure and openly collaborating with the enemy. And this guy was exchanged in the prisoner exchange by Vladimir Putin for like hundreds of people. That's how valuable he is to Russia.
And you say, well, we're at war, so war measures are normal. Yeah, that's great. We invoked the War Measures Act in Canada, and we saw what the government did with it. When the government doesn't give up power once it takes it, and it invokes the War Measures Act.
No, but this is a country that's actually at war, unlike Canada.
Well, no, but now,
right?
So let's get to this. That there are people who will argue that this is not about not global conquest, about broader conquest than the Donbass region, the eastern region of Ukraine, which voted or views itself as being a part of Russia, or at least independent from Ukraine, and that this is not a war, but this is rather to affirm the autonomy of those eastern states that view themselves either as autonomous or part of Russia.
So when Chechnya tries to break away from Russia, Russia is entitled to fight 2 wars and force them into submission, install their puppet in Kadyrov, and retain Chechnya as part of the Russian Federation, right?
I can tell you one thing.
That's fine?
No, well, no.
Is that okay?
I would not venture any opinion on Chechnya because my learning curve on the Ukraine-Russia conflict has been steep enough.
My point is, if a part of a country wants to break away, is that country entitled to protect its territorial integrity or not?
If part of the country wants to break away, and the country that says we own you, you don't get to break away, and it was actually part of the election of Zelensky in the first place, which was to negotiate a resolution to that disputed territory and not be egged on into war by Big Brother and Big Bullies who are helping you.
Zelensky was elected after those territories were already part conquered by Russia. There were never any votes in those areas to join any other country until they were invaded by Russia. Crimea was simply taken by Russia, and then they've held referendums. Now, if you take a country and you put your own troops in there, any referendum you hold after that is obviously bullshit, right? If Canada decides to invade the north of the United States and take a couple of states, invades them, captures them, and has a referendum, and they decide to stay in Canada, is that legitimate?
Well, no, there's nuance that's being left out of that hypothesis. When the eastern provinces they
voted for Zelensky overwhelmingly, you know that, right? He got more votes in the east than he did in the west.
From what I understand, it depends on where you break it down and what areas you're talking about.
No. He was overwhelmingly elected by the eastern regions. He lost the west and won by the eastern central regions in those elections.
There's a dispute over eastern provinces, which historically have changed hands a number of times. So not like Canada just invading the US.
And what happened, I think, is neither Russia nor Ukraine were particularly happy with the Minsk Accords. They were not sustainable. Neither side followed them. And that's why you have the conflict that you have. But a better example would be, Canada, okay, let's take Mexico. There are several states in the United States that used to be part of Mexico. Is Mexico entitled to invade the United States and have referendums in Texas and California and whatever else, Arizona, whatever?
There's a lot of imperfections with that analogy in that they're not current issues. And they're not current debates, and they're not ones that are...
Well, if Mexico was powerful enough, they would be current issues because Mexico would fund rebels in those areas. But the reason it doesn't happen is the United States is a lot stronger than Mexico. That's all. However, this conflict is resolved, and I don't think it will be resolved for a while because neither side is tired of fighting. What then needs to end up happening is Russia will probably keep some portion of the territories it currently occupies. And in exchange for that, as I've said from day one, Ukraine gets some kind of long-term security. And that means you will either have to join NATO or there's a peacekeeping force and you get some kind of Korean-style split scenario.
Joining NATO might be the very, what some people perceive to be their existential threat is NATO expanding into Ukraine. It is biological weapon factories, whatever, research facilities in Ukraine.
All this stuff about Ukraine becoming a threat is all bullshit anyway, because Russia has a border with NATO already. It has a border with NATO already. So if that was an issue, it wouldn't be such a big deal anyway. Look,
what would be the size comparison between the border? I presume you mean
it's a smaller border, of course it is, but nuclear weapons don't need a big border, right? Do you know who are the biggest supporters of Ukraine's defense by percentage of GDP?
By GDP, so it's not going to be by raw number. I think I'll say the US anyhow.
Okay, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Sweden, Finland. What do you think these countries have in common? A border with Russia. What do you think they know that people on Twitter don't?
I think that statistic.
They are risking so much. They are risking confronting and antagonizing an aggressive Russian state by supporting Ukraine. Why do you think they're doing that?
Well, you're going to say for the existential fear of Russia expanding. They might be
correct.
Next.